Welcome to our webinar today, Selective Mutism and Reluctant Speakers, Practical Strategies for Parents and Caregivers. Our presenters today are Dr. Alex DiGiacomo, Dr. Rosalind Catchpole, and Dr. Tamara Sally. My name is Michelle Horn, and I'm the Program Manager for the BC Children's Kelty Mental Health Resource Centre. Before we begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the land on which I'm joining this webinar from today is the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the unceded territory of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. Today's webinar is part of a webinar series on selective mutism and reluctant speakers. The first webinar was held on May 17th and was for school professionals. So that webinar is now available from our website, and today's webinar recording will be available from the same link that you see on your screen within 2 to 3 days. My colleague will also post this link in the chat icon, and you'll also receive a follow-up email tomorrow with this link as well, so no need to write it down. A few housekeeping notes before we begin. So as noted at the beginning, everyone is automatically muted and your cameras are turned off, so we can't see or hear you, so no need to worry about that. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation, so if you have any questions for the speakers, please submit those through the Q&A icon. There's been an option enabled where you can vote for questions that other people have submitted that you would also like to see answered, and there's also an option for you to submit your questions anonymously. If you have any technical questions or concerns, such as issues with audio or video, please submit those through the chat icon. At the end of the webinar, a survey will pop up that we really would appreciate if you could complete. It really helps us to plan for future webinars. A PDF of these slides is currently available on our website from this link, and we'll also send that link out through the chat to you as well today if you wanted to follow along with that. The webinar is being recorded and will be available at the same link as well. So also wanted to note that the information in this webinar applies to the context in British Columbia. If you're from another jurisdiction, please consult your local health and school authorities for further information. So it's now my pleasure to introduce our speakers today. Dr. Alex DiGiacomo is a postdoctoral fellow in the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Clinic at BC Children's Hospital and the Department of Psychiatry at UBC. She is also a psychology associate at Cornerstone Child and Family Psychology Clinic. She provides clinical services to children, youth, and families, and conducts research to better understand anxiety disorders. Dr. Alex has a particular interest in supporting skillful and confident parenting and in equipping children to conquer fears and challenges. Dr. Tamara Sally is a child and adolescent psychiatrist working in the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Clinic at BC Children's Hospital, as well as the physician lead for child and youth psychiatry in Richmond. She also works in the Early Childhood Mental Health Program in Richmond, the Richmond School Program, and the Child and Adolescent Program in Richmond. She's a clinical instructor in the Department of Psychiatry at UBC as well. She has a strong interest in anxiety disorders in children and youth, as well as in infant psychiatry. And Dr. Rosalind Catchpole is a registered psychologist and head of the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Clinic at BC Children's Hospital. She is actively involved in treatment, teaching, and research on anxiety disorders, and has a particular interest in parent-led treatment approaches, including those for school refusal. She recently worked with the Canadian Mental Health Association to develop the Confident Parents Driving Kids Anxiety program. She has also worked with Anxiety Canada to develop educational materials. She is a clinical instructor in the Department of Psychiatry at UBC and a director of Cornerstone Child and Family Psychology Clinic. So thank you so much to all of our speakers for being here with us today. I'll now pass it over to you, Dr. Catchpole.
Great. Thanks so much, Michelle. Before we begin, we really wanted to acknowledge with immense gratitude that we live, work, and play on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh Nation. We also had some professional acknowledgements we wanted to share. Selective mutism and reluctant talking is a topic so near and dear to our hearts, and several colleagues have really helped us along the way in terms of developing and refining our treatment approach. And that includes Dr. Stephen Kurtz, who developed the model we'll talk about today, Dr. Annie Simpson, who was instrumental in bringing it to Vancouver, and then our dear colleagues at Children's Hospital, so Dr. Susan Baer, Dr. Janet Ma, Dr. Megan McFadden, and our dear late friend, Dr. Jane Garland. We're so grateful to all of them. So I'm going to give you a bit of a roadmap about what we're going to cover today. We're going to talk to you about what selective mutism is and what it isn't, and a little bit more about reluctant talkers. We're going to give you some really practical strategies today, how to set your child up for speaking success, how to collaborate with preschool or daycare or school environments, how to really build momentum and expand speech to different situations. Finally, we'll talk about how and when to reach out for extra help, and we'll leave a few minutes at the end for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Catchpole. Selective mutism is an anxiety disorder. It describes children who are able to speak comfortably and fully at home with people that they're familiar with and who have a harder time talking in other environments or with people they are less comfortable with. Parents will often tell us their child is like two different children in different places. At home, they might be complete chatterbugs, talking nonstop, loud, bossy, whereas the minute they enter the preschool parking lot, they stop talking even to mom or dad. It affects about 1% or just under 1% of children, and it's a little bit more common in girls than in boys. And it will be a bit more common if a child learns English as a second language or was a little bit late to learn language altogether. It's different from a child who doesn't have language, so these children speak really well or comfortably as their peers do when they're in a comfortable setting. Most parents won't notice that their child has selective mutism until they're around 2 or 3 and they start to leave the home environment. They may have noticed their child is a little bit inhibited or slow to warm up as a baby or as a toddler, perhaps being more difficult to pass around to different people to hold, or perhaps not smiling as easily in the grocery store, for example. But it's not really until the child joins different activities in the community or goes to preschool or to daycare where a teacher might come up and say to the parent, "Oh, does your child speak?" And the parent might be quite surprised to find out that they don't in those other environments. So it's around 2, 3, and 4 that parents will first realize their child is struggling with talking in new environments. We know that selective mutism is not due to abuse or trauma or the child being oppositional or difficult. It's due to anxiety. It's also not quite the same thing as shyness. Many children and adults struggle with shyness, which is a feeling of discomfort having to get to know new people or talking to people that are unfamiliar. But children with selective mutism won't speak or will speak extremely minimally in new environments and with new people. And they just don't warm up and grow out of it in the same way that one would expect a shy child might. It's not a form of autism or a developmental disability or an inability to speak. It is an anxiety about speaking in a new place. It's important to identify selective mutism early and to try to intervene as early as possible, which is part of why we're doing this talk today. It can certainly affect children's confidence when they are unable to talk to their friends at school or to teachers or to strangers. They recognize that this is different and it makes them feel less confident to explore the world around them. As well, for children who have a hard time talking, they have less opportunity to practice making friends, playing with new children, developing their social skills, and regulating their emotions. All of that turn-taking and standing up for oneself, saying, "I was in line first," or "I want to have a turn on the swing," or "that was my toy," doesn't happen if a child isn't able to talk to their peers. As well, school is just more fun when children can talk. They make friends more easily, they're able to do their show and tell and share things about themselves. So they miss out on a lot of the fun and learning opportunities if they're unable to speak at school. Also, we want to be sure that children can stand up for themselves and tell someone if they're feeling unsafe or hurt or upset. So being able to advocate for themselves is an important skill we want these children to be able to develop. The good news is that selective mutism is quite treatable, and parents should feel very hopeful that with intervention, their child's selective mutism can improve. Often it takes a concerted effort and a team approach with school, with caregivers, as well as with family and community members. But with that intervention, children will often become much more confident in their speaking and be able to speak in new places and with others around them. Our goal today is to help you as parents and caregivers to know where to start in this process if your child is a reluctant speaker or has selective mutism.
Thanks so much, Dr. Sally. And so like Dr. Sally said, selective mutism is an anxiety disorder. So what we want to do first is really understand what is it that keeps anxiety going. So let's think about an example. Let's say that your child is really afraid of seeing dogs, okay? And let's say you're on a walk with your child and a dog is approaching. So for your child, their anxiety is going to be climbing as they get closer and closer to that dog. And then eventually the anxiety and the distress will peak. It will reach its highest point. And the thing that we know about emotional distress and anxiety is that it's impossible for it to last forever. So it always eventually goes down, even if we're staying in the situation that first made us scared, like the dog for your child. Let's say, though, if the dog is approaching and your child just gets really, really afraid and he ends up just running away or turning around or somehow escaping or avoiding, what will happen in that situation is his anxiety will also go down. And in fact, it's going to go down even faster than if he stayed in the situation. Here's where the problem is, though. So the second time or the third or the fourth or the fifth time that we try something hard, so for your child seeing another dog, if the time before he stayed and, kind of stayed with the dog and maybe even pet the dog, the second, third, or fourth or fifth time, his anxiety would be lower. But if he ran away, the next time he's in that same situation, his anxiety is going to be higher. And there's a simple reason for that. The reason is because his memory of his anxiety going down the time before is tied to him escaping. So what he learns is, oh, my anxiety only goes down if I run away. So really, to recap, what we know is that one of the things that keeps anxiety going is avoidance. And then one of the things that actually makes it better is facing fears. So if your child had kind of stayed in the situation with the dog, maybe pet the dog the first time, his anxiety would be lower the second, third, fourth, or fifth time. Okay, now let's look at this in the specific example of selective mutism. So we refer to this cycle that you see here as the non-speaking cycle. So let's take a look at how this might go for a child with selective mutism. So let's say you're in a grocery store and you're with your child and you see a friend who you haven't seen in many, many years. It would be very normal for that person to try to engage your child, right? They might say, oh, hi, it's so good to meet you. What's your name? And then, your child, if they're kind of predisposed to having a bit of a sensitive temperament and they're a bit slow to warm up, they might get anxious. And they might get so anxious that they totally avoid, right? They might hide, they might cling to you, they might bury their head. And then after a few seconds, either you or the friend will probably come in and say something, right? So the friend might say, oh, it's okay, you don't have to tell me. Or you might step in and say, oh, this is Sam. So someone will rescue the situation. And then what happens is that your child's anxiety and your anxiety, because it's uncomfortable to be in that spot, right, where someone's asked your child a question and they're not answering, everyone's anxiety is going to go down. So when this happens time and time and time and time again, what children end up learning is, oh, if I just don't answer, I just avoid, I'm going to feel better. And so as we know, one of the things that helps with anxiety is facing fears. So these two orange boxes right here, this is where all of our brave talking work happens. This is where the magic happens. And this is where we can work to interrupt this cycle to help kids to not avoid talking and to do it instead. So really what this talk is all about, it's all about the brave talking cycle, where the goal is to get children closer and closer to normal talking. Now, Dr. Catchpole is going to discuss these steps in detail, but I want you to have an overview of what we're aiming for to get kids having a successful talking experience. So first, a child would be warmed up and they would be made comfortable, and then they'd be prompted to talk and engage in a really strategic way. Then, the child would get anxious, but their anxiety would be manageable. Then they would talk in some way. Then they would get some praise. And ultimately, child and adult, everyone in the situation, their anxiety would still be lowered, but instead what the child would learn is that it's okay to talk. I can talk and my anxiety goes down just the same. So I just also want to say the two things that aren't in this brave talking cycle, the things that we're trying to get away from, are having a child avoid and having an adult rescue. So if you're listening to this webinar today, probably you have a child who's struggling to find their voice. So we've got a 5-step framework to help guide your work with them. So first, you'd want to identify where your child is struggling. Where are they not talking? Then we're going to brainstorm initial brave talking goals. Then it's time to prepare. So we need to set the stage for success, both with the tools and with the team. Then you'll ready yourself. And we actually never used to include this 4th step, but we've found that it's actually quite key to these successful outcomes. And then finally, you're going to act and use the SM skills. So we'll talk about each of these in detail as we go through. Okay, and we wanted to give you some really good concrete examples of what we're talking about. So throughout the talk, we'll be referring to a child who we'll call Nellie. So what you need to know about Nellie is that she's a 5-year-old Chinese-Canadian girl. She lives with her parents, her younger brother, and she loves her pet dog, Susie. She's very outgoing. She's quite the chatterbox at home, loves to play with her dog, play dress up, do arts and crafts, and she also loves gummy bears. So that will become important, and we'll tell you why in a bit. So what Nellie's mother noticed is that she tends to kind of shut down and not speak around really anybody aside from her immediate family and some of her cousins, some of her extended family. And so she brought her to the pediatrician. The pediatrician actually made a diagnosis of selective mutism, and Nellie's mother had never heard of it. So where we'll start kind of the story is how Nellie's mother began reading about how to help her child. So first, step 1, what she did was she identified where Nellie is struggling. So we want to be thinking about, okay, who is already in your child's talking circle and where do they need help being brave? This is just to map it out for us. So as an example for Nellie, like I said, she had no problem at all talking with her immediate family, her parents and her brother. No problem with her dog, no problem with her extended family. And when she was out in the community, let's say at a grocery store or library or whatever, she was okay to talk to her parents in those situations as long as there was nobody kind of nearby. And she really liked one of the neighborhood kids and talked a bit kind of to her parents if that girl was there, but mostly not when the family was outside with the neighbors. And so the areas where she struggled a lot was school. So she didn't talk at all at school, not to the teacher, not to her peers, not to anyone at church. She takes swimming lessons, didn't talk to her swim teacher or her parents' friends, or really anywhere in the community either. And this is a typical, map that we would see, where really most places children aren't speaking. Okay, so now step 2, we're brainstorming what are the first talking goals. And what's important to say here is there's no hard and fast rule about how to order these, right? So really it's about what's most important to your family, what's most important to your child. So for Nellie, her mom decided, I really want Nellie to begin talking to her teacher and, a couple peers at school. So that was one of her early goals. The extended personal community was very important for Nellie's family. So they spend lots of time kind of on the street with all of the neighborhood friends. And so that was something that was important to them that they wanted to work on right away. And then Nellie also really likes hot chocolate. So they wanted her to be able to order her own hot chocolate. Okay, so that's what we're aiming for. Now, step 3. So what we know about working with kids with selective mutism is it's super important to be prepared. So you need a toolkit. You need to have a toolkit ready. And there are warm-up tools and then brave talking tools. So we'll talk about both. In terms of warm-up tools, what you really need is a quiet space and some time. So this isn't the kind of work that you do when you're in a rush or when, when you're really busy and have a lot on your mind. So that, it's quiet space and some time. And then, luckily, since we're talking to caregivers here, you will know your child best. So you will know the kinds of things that they love to do. And so having their favorite activities ready is super important, and ones that don't require talking. So just some popular examples that we often use and are useful are things like drawing supplies, arts and crafts, Jenga, going for walks outside in nature, exploring. For Nellie, what we actually did was use playing with her dog. So it can be anything that they enjoy that doesn't require talking. Okay, now for the brave talking tools. So I don't want to say the most important, but one of the most important brave talking tools is what we call reinforcers. And those really are just rewards or prizes. And that's to get motivation going, to get momentum going, which is all really important in this kind of work. So that can be things like points, stickers, candy, dollar store prizes. For older kids, what we find is more helpful. Often older kids want to work towards kind of a bigger prize, so like a video game or something. And so what we find is we can break that up into smaller pieces so that with each, little step that they take, they can earn a part of a video game. So it depends all on the age of the child. And then we need some individual and group talking games. And so the important part of this is don't get too worried about what the game actually is, because you can get creative and turn really anything into a talking game. But one that we love is Spot It, because it works well for kids of all different ages. It's fun, it's easy to play, it's portable, it's easy to move around. Zingo, Guess Who, Go Fish, but really anything. And then we like to do these things called talking quests. And so this is more about having kids practice going out in the community, walking up to strangers, maybe going around their class, asking kids questions. So these are more things like people bingo, talking scavenger hunts, and I'll show you some examples of what I mean by this. So you would just print this out and have your child use it. So, questions like, do you have a sister or no sister? Do you like pizza or sushi better? Or for the scavenger one, it would be, okay, go find someone who has 3 brothers. And in order to do that, of course, you have to say, do you have 3 brothers? So there's obviously a lot of talking involved in these games. Okay, so now that you have your tools ready, it's important to think about a team. So what we know about working with kids who have SM or who are reluctant speakers is it is really a team sport. And one kind of nice thing that we've noticed over the years is that most of the time, people are really willing to help. Some of our favorite moments have been when a barista or, a cashier at the dollar store have been really important parts of the team. And really, it can take just a little bit of prep to tell them, oh, hey, can you read this script out? And you'll find out more about the encouraging talking tools later. But be creative in thinking who can be on your brave talking team. One part of the team that we wanted to spend a bit of time talking about is the school team, because most kids with selective mutism struggle at school. So what we know for sure is that communicating well with the school team is really important. When we think about the school team, we think about them having 2 different roles, and we've called them the coach role and the quarterback role. So the coach at the school would be someone to kind of big picture coordinate the SM work that you're doing and kind of figuring out the next move. Whereas the quarterback is the person most likely who your child feels the most comfortable with, might be their classroom teacher, resource teacher, administrator, who will establish speech with the child and then be the person to pass the ball on to other people. One kind of tip that's worked really well for us is sending the school a video of your child when they're comfortable and in their home environment, because what can sometimes often happen is that school professionals and teachers, they don't actually get to know kids' real personalities because, of course, they aren't talking at school. And so sending them a video helps them to kind of see, okay, what are we aiming for? What are we shooting for? What is this kid really like when they're comfortable and at home? And perhaps the biggest point we want to make here is, as Bryn and Michelle were saying at the beginning, we actually did a webinar specifically for school professionals, and we laid out all of the steps to kind of help them to support these kids. So we would encourage you to send them that talk, and that will really help get things going. Okay, so step 1, 2, and 3 are done. Now, this is the step where I mentioned at the beginning, we didn't used to always include this, but what we've noticed about readying yourself as caregivers, as parents, is that when families have been able to do this, often the outcomes are really beautiful. So here's really the thing. Even though we know that helping our kids face their fears is the key, really the key to improving their talking, we also know that this can be extremely hard to do. And it's harder for some people than it is for other people. Let me tell you a few of the reasons it's so emotionally difficult. Number 1, we're all wired to protect our kids. So think about, your child struggling and being in distress. Your pull most likely is to protect them and kind of support them. You won't be pulled automatically, instinctually, to help them face their fears. And so this work really does require us to kind of go against our instincts in some way. The other thing is that emotions are shared. They're shared things. So when our children are distressed and anxious, it's pretty easy for us to catch that, emotion, and then as a result for us to struggle with coping with that distress. The other thing that's worth saying is we might have our own social anxiety, and this work is hard in general, but it's even harder if you have social anxiety because it involves, sometimes going up to strangers. It involves advocating for kids in social situations. So this might be especially difficult for you if that's the situation that you're in. So really all that to say, keep pacing in mind. So this is, working on SM, it's often a marathon and not a sprint. And although it's true that for some kids, they may just need a few weeks of strategies and then they might be off to the races. For other families, this is a longer road. And so pacing yourself and being kind to yourself and acknowledging that it is frustrating, sometimes it is hard, is important. So remember earlier we were talking about, rescuing and avoiding. So with selective mutism, some of the things that we can tend to do when our child is not wanting to talk is jump in to answer for them, for example, or letting them communicate non-verbally. So letting them kind of shake their head or nod, or mind reading to kind of guess what they're trying to say instead of asking them to communicate verbally. So the point here is because emotions are shared, and when your child is anxious, it's more likely to make you anxious, and then it's going to go in a cycle around and around. It's important to try not to do those things. And you will not do it perfectly. None of us do it perfectly, and that is okay. Luckily, we don't need to be perfect in order to do this work. We just need to do a decent job at it. And instead, what is helpful is to communicate confidence. So the beautiful thing about emotions being shared is that they're also shared when it's a positive emotion like bravery or courage. So when you can communicate confidence to your child by, taking a deep breath, keeping a smile on your face, remembering that it's normal for them to feel anxious and to want to avoid brave talking. So you can expect some distress. If they're anxious, it doesn't mean that you're doing anything wrong. It just means that it's hard. That's all that it means. And remember that with an appropriate plan, which you'll hear about soon how to make that plan, but with an appropriate plan, it's not harmful to encourage our kids to face their fears. And in fact, it's actually what's best for them. So to kind of summarize that, the most helpful way of interacting with kids who are about to do something really hard, there are two ingredients. So one is empathy and one is encouragement. So a response would look something like saying, look, Nellie, I know using your brave voice feels really scary, and I know you can do it. I'm so proud of you. What can happen as parents sometimes is we can, depending on our personality, our upbringing, lots of things, we can tend to fall on one side or another of this. So we can tend to be a little bit too soft. So an example of that would be kind of having these thoughts of, oh my goodness, this kid is so scared. Should I just take them out of school? Should I just not push them? I don't think they can handle it. Or we might fall on the side of being a little bit too tough. So a sign that you might fall more on that side would be having thoughts like, oh, this silence just is not acceptable. They cannot be allowed to get away with this. And by the way, both of these things are normal. All of us have these different ways that we tend to fall. But the key is to just remembering that both the empathy and the encouragement, both of those are the ingredients for the most helpful response.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. DiGiacomo. So my part of the presentation is really the ACT part. So we've outlined kind of how to get yourself ready, how to prepare. And now I'm really going to talk about what are some really practical situations you can set up to help your child be brave. And one thing I wanted to say is that at the end of this talk, you'll find a link for a video done by Anxiety Canada that actually shows these skills in action. So we encourage you to watch that after you've seen this webinar, because it'll give you a little bit of a sense of what it looks like kind of brought to life. So you're going to use these SM skills in areas that you've identified as areas you want to work on. So you want to refer back to that stuff you did in the early steps around planning. And there's two equally important skills when you're working with a child who has some anxiety talking in new situations. The first is warm up, and the second is encouraging brave talking. And I'm going to talk about both of those. Okay, so the first thing to remember is kids, particularly more sensitive kids or kids more on the anxious side, do so much better when we give them a chance to kind of warm up and get settled in a new situation. We don't want to go in kind of guns a-blazing asking kids with selective mutism or reluctant talkers a bunch of questions at the beginning. It just makes them too anxious. So what you want to do as a parent or caregiver is practice these warm-up skills at home. We know that your kids talk to you. We know that they don't need these warm-up skills at home, but you want to practice them so that you could use them on a play date, or you could use them kind of in a new situation, or use them at school. And so we're going to talk about what those look like. And before I do talk about it, I did want to make a quick note or comment about manners. So you are watching this webinar. You are all lovely, dedicated parents to begin with. I'm sure it matters to you that your kids are polite. What we really strongly recommend is let go of the kind of hi, bye, please, thank you prompts until you're well down this road. Because it's harder for kids to do those than to do other kinds of talking. Okay, so setting the stage for a minute, and I'm focusing more on younger kids in these examples because it is more common in younger kids. But just to say, if you have an older child or a teen with selective mutism, you can absolutely still use these skills. You just modify them a bit. So I'm talking about, a play example. With a teen, it might be that you're watching a YouTube video together. But the key is, instead of asking questions right up front, instead, you just want to describe or comment on what's going on. So maybe we say to Nellie, wow, you're petting Susie the dog so nicely, instead of saying, oh, do you want to pet the dog? So we describe instead of ask questions. Or maybe we comment on the YouTube video that we're watching. Oh my gosh, that's so hilarious, the way that guy, I don't know, wiped out on his skateboard or whatever. So the idea is just to sort of connect and comment without asking questions. And we do this during a period of child-led play, right? So just something fun that your kid enjoys, Lego or drawing or something like that. So with praise, we want to just say things like, wow, I love the way you're dressing that doll so beautifully. That's really great work. I really like the way the top matches so nicely with the bottom. We want to play with the child. So we kind of want to, imitate a bit what they're doing, play as well. We want to enjoy and have fun. And if our child is talking, we want to repeat what they're saying, right? So if the child says, oh, he's barking, you want to say, wow, he is barking. He's barking really loudly. And so what we do, and again, watch the video that's at the end of the talk so you kind of see this in action. The idea is just to get them comfortable and let that anxiety about just kind of being in a new situation settle before we go in with questions. Now, we don't just stop with warm up because then they'll get comfortable, but they won't actually practice their brave talking. So after a period of warm up, we start asking some questions of kids. And what we know is that the type of question matters. So most often, the type of question that's most likely to get a verbal answer from a child is what we call a forced choice question or a two-option question. So asking a child, do you like chocolate or broccoli better? Or should we keep playing inside or should we go outside? Are typically easier questions for kids to answer because they just have a couple of options. Now, open-ended questions are great as well. They're sometimes a little bit harder for kids, what did you do on the weekend or something like that. But they're nice and they encourage longer answers and a bit more spontaneous speech. So those are very appropriate to use as well when you're encouraging talking. We try to stay away from too many yes/no questions because, particularly for kids with SM, if we ask a yes/no question, they're very likely to nod or shake their head. And we're trying to work on their brave talking, not their brave nodding. And so if a child does, if you forget, which you will, it's fine, and ask a yes/no question, what you want to do is say, oh, I see you're nodding. Does that mean yes or something different? The next skill is give the child a long time to answer, at least 5 seconds, which feels a little uncomfortable. The reason for that is, first of all, that it really communicates that you're expecting a response from your child. And the second reason is when we're anxious, it actually slows down our processing. And so kids sometimes do take longer to answer. Now, if you've asked them a question, so again, this is on a play date or in a coffee shop or something like that, and they haven't answered, instead of just letting them off the hook and ordering that food for them or talking for them, what you want to do is try to make it just that little bit easier. So you might rephrase the question. If you've asked them, what do you want, from the coffee shop, let's say, and they don't answer, you might say, well, you can have a cookie or you can have broccoli pie. I don't know, something that makes it easy, to give them just 2 options. And then you wait another 5 seconds. And if they still don't answer because the cashier is quite nearby and they're still looking kind of nervous, you might pull them just a little bit farther away from that situation, but ask them the question. So the idea, the goal, instead of complete avoidance, like Dr. DiGiacomo kind of talked about at the beginning, the goal is just to get closer and closer to regular talking. Now, the next skill is what you do after they do say something. So when a child speaks, if they're a reluctant talker or they have SM, often it's going to be a bit quiet at the beginning. And so one key skill we really like to use is just repeat what they say. If your child says, I want a cookie, you say, you want a cookie. Thanks so much for telling me that you want a cookie. My child will have a cookie. So we do a bit of that sort of microphoning to help others know that they've been speaking. It also communicates that we really care that they're answering. The next skill is praise. Thank you for telling me that you want a cookie. I love it so much when you tell me what you want. And then finally, as Dr. DiGiacomo mentioned earlier, we want a reward. So kids typically do better when they're working towards a prize or they're getting a little sticker if they're younger, or some points. And so we just, again, want to acknowledge their hard work. Okay. I'm going to go over a couple more principles that you can use in this work. The first is what we call the Fadein Principle. And so the Fadein Principle really refers to the fact that trying to talk to a new person all at once, it is tricky sometimes. But if we do it slowly, almost like sort of turning up the brightness or sort of turning up the intensity of that interaction slowly, it often goes quite beautifully. And this is one of the core principles we use even as therapists when we're starting to meet a child. We really do this, and it's amazing how well it works most of the time. And so the way this works, and again, please, there's lots of information in this talk today, so it will be recorded and you can go back and look at it again, so that if you need a bit more information. So the idea is on the left in that blue box you see, there's an established talking relationship with person A. Let's say the parent or the caregiver. The goal is to work on talking to person B, maybe the neighbor. And so what the idea is, you do some warm up with your child. We're still in COVID time, so let's say that's outside. You're playing with your child and talking. You've pre-planned with the neighbor, let's say, that they're going to kind of come by and say hi, maybe drop off something, and then they're going to sit a little bit farther away. You keep talking and playing with your child while the neighbor's a bit farther away. And as long as they're continuing to talk, the neighbor gets a little closer. They sit maybe within earshot. And as your child is talking and the neighbor's now sitting, much closer to you, you might prompt your neighbor to ask a question. So if you're playing with dolls, you might say, oh, ask Nellie, if this is a new doll or it's a doll she's had for a long time. And you see if Nellie can answer. If she can't, you go to your backup plan. So you go to your plan B of, oh, you know what, we're going to go over here and say the answer a little bit farther away. Nellie tells you, you microphone it back to the neighbor. We work towards Nellie being able to answer questions directly from the neighbor. And once that can happen, you can slowly fade out of that situation. So you might go for a little bit further away or go get a glass of water or something like that. And this is a key mechanism by which kids expand their talking circle. So here's an example of talking to a teacher with using these same principles. So again, we only move on to the next step if the child is still talking. And the pacing is going to vary. For some kids, this is a 20-minute process. For some kids, this might be 6 dedicated sessions where they get, just a couple steps up the ladder each time. And of course, the goals and steps are going to vary depending on whether they already speak to the teacher a little bit or they've never spoken to anyone in the building. But generally, and again, this should sound very familiar with what I said on the last slide. So in this case, we look on the bottom left here, Nellie and mom, let's say, are alone in the schoolyard and they're playing with the dog because Nellie really likes the dog and we know that encourages talking. The teacher pops over briefly and then maybe sits at a distant picnic table. As long as Nellie is still talking, teacher comes a bit closer, sits within earshot. Teacher is going to have some rewards. It's COVID, so we're going to wrap up the gummy bears nice and safely. And then starts to give those rewards when the child answers. And so mom will tell the teacher to ask Nellie if she likes playing catch with Susie or if she doesn't. And either Nellie answers directly or we go to that plan B, where she answers a little bit farther away. But either way, we try to get a verbal response, even if that's 20 feet away to begin with. The teacher praises, rewards with the gummy bears, and asks another question. And that process with the parent microphoning continues on until the child can actually speak to the teacher directly. At that point, mom kind of fades out. Mom says, oh, I need to make a phone call. I'll be back. And the child keeps talking to the teacher. Okay. There's another one here, which I'm not going to go over, but we wanted to include it in the talk just so you had another idea of how to fade in. So this is about a play date. So I'm going to skip this slide, but you've got it to look back upon in the slides. Okay. The last principle I'm going to talk about is the scaffolding principle. So this is another key principle that's really at the core of the work we do. And this is the way we get a kid from I am nowhere close to this goal, let's say of ordering a cookie, all the way to I've got this goal. And this is one, by the way, we use with older kids a lot. And my nice COVID-friendly version of this is I've been getting a lot of older kids lately to work on ordering pizza on the phone, right? And so we do a lot of rehearsal in advance, a lot of practice before it's actually sort of go time. Okay, so let me talk you through this a little bit. And this works for lots of things, show and tell, speaking to peers, ordering, but you'll see what I mean. So the first key is practice, practice, practice. So for ordering, we might make a script. So if the child is ordering on the phone, we can exactly write out what they're going to say. I would like a cheese pizza with extra cheese or whatever they're ordering. We want to practice the script with the caregiver several times. We want to practice with another person if possible, several times. For in-person ordering, we want to then practice in a new location. We want to practice in the car outside the coffee shop. Then we want to practice right outside the door of the store. Then we want to practice in the store, but not right near the cashier or the barista. Then we want to do the real thing. So then we want to have the questions be asked of the child, but they're going to tell the parent the answer, and the parent is going to microphone, say, oh, thank you for saying you want a cookie. My child wants a cookie. And then we work towards the child just directly ordering themselves without any microphoning needed. And the idea on this is if a child needs some help in getting from A to B, if we work on these steps over and over again, it actually helps them be successful.
Thank you, Dr. Catchpole. We're just going to start here with some tips for success. It's a lot of information to take in, so we're going to highlight just a few things that we've learned over the years with our work. And the first one is don't underestimate the value of momentum. And what that means is the first few questions that you ask a child in a new place, for example, are the hardest questions to answer. So if you've started playing a game or you're on a roll with asking your child questions or having someone else ask some questions or having them talk to a peer and things are going well, don't take a break in the middle of that. If possible, try to build on that momentum and get them talking as much as they can in that moment. Children often become less inhibited as the activity that you've set out for them unfolds. So keep going with the momentum. And remember your brave talking ladder. So you want to be setting a new goal every week or every few weeks, depending on the severity of your child's selective mutism. You're going to want to take a step up that ladder on an ongoing basis. Even if a step feels hard and you're stuck for a while, remember the goal is to keep climbing up. So adding in one new friend is great, but you want to continue to add in a neighbor, a friend at church, a friend in the playground, and you want to keep adding more and more people into this child's talking circle. At the same time, we know that children have a hard time if too many things change at once. So when we do this work with children, we make sure to follow the rule of only changing one thing at a time. So if we're adding a new friend into their talking circle, we keep the same game that we did with the old friend in the same room that we did it with. So we won't change the location plus the activity plus the person. So just make sure to think about that as you walk up the ladder, change one thing at a time. Also, especially with little children, movement and silliness will really help them unfreeze. So if you're hosting a play date with a new friend, having them run around and play tag outside is a good way to start the warm-up period. So anytime they can do dancing, running, playing, moving, they're more likely to talk with greater ease. Another tip is to remember pacing. So try and pick times to practice, for example, the brave talking, and don't feel like you have to do it all the time. So you're not always worrying about it or setting up situations for the child to practice. Set aside some time in your day, but don't overwhelm yourself, as for some children, it can take a longer time for them to get more comfortable talking, and that self-care piece include the pacing. As well, if you do find you're getting stuck on a rung of the ladder, consider changing course, but not taking a step backwards. So what that means is if you've added a new kid in the neighborhood into their talking circle and that's not going well and you've tried a few times, rather than go back to them only playing the game with their sibling, maybe try an aunt or an uncle or someone different to continue to improve their talking circle without going backwards. Finally, this work does take a lot of time, a lot of energy, and a lot of effort and thoughtfulness. And so we know for parents already looking after small kids or even older kids is overwhelming and requires all your attention throughout the day. So remember, it does take energy, and be kind to yourselves. Now, this was a question that comes up all the time from parents is, when do I know if I have to reach out to ask for help? When should I go to my doctor, or when should I ask for someone to help me with this process? So we put a few tips here just to, create some guidelines for you as parents and caregivers. If your child is stuck on the same step for several weeks, despite trying different ways to move laterally or being creative or continuing to change the rewards, if they really are quite stuck, that would be a time to reach out for help. Also, if your child is looking very frozen, like physically frozen, has a hard time moving, really shut down, that would be something to consider in terms of reaching out for help. As well, if you've made quite a few solid efforts to get them to order in, Tim Hortons, or to have a play date with another friend, about 4 to 6 times, you've set it up, you've really practiced, you've scaffolded, and things aren't going well, you might at that point want to reach out also. And for older children, we know it's just so much harder to work with older children who've had that many more years of practicing their selective mutism. So when a child is older, also I would have a lower threshold for reaching out at that point. And then where to go seek help. So there's a few options for caregivers and parents. The first one would be to self-refer to your local child and youth mental health team. Every municipality has a child and youth mental health team, and it is a self-refer process. So if you go on that link, you'll find the phone number for the one that corresponds to your address, and you would call them up, and they would have certain days where they would intake families, and you would just make that phone call and be able to set up a time to put your child on the wait list for the child and youth mental health team. Also, you can go to your family doctor and ask for a referral to a pediatrician. And so that's another way that parents will get help, or even just clarification around the diagnosis of selective mutism or ideas about other resources. For some families where cases are quite severe, for an older child, or the child really is struggling and not doing well with the local resources, a referral to the Mood and Anxiety Disorders Clinic at Children's Hospital might make sense at that point, and that's done by the family doctor or pediatrician. And finally, families can also look for a private psychologist or allied health worker, such as a speech and language therapist who has expertise in treating selective mutism, to help your family out with either creating a plan or working on a plan and helping you to understand if your child needs more assistance. Finally, I'm going to speak a little bit about the role of medication. I think this is always a challenging area for parents to consider, putting their child on a medication, and even to know where to go to have those conversations. So medication is helpful for some children with selective mutism. It's not necessary for all children by any means, and the decision around whether to use medication is quite complicated and needs to take into consideration a lot of factors. But medication can be very helpful in bringing down the level of anxiety and frozenness that a child experiences, allowing them to do all this work that you've set out for them so they can expand their brave talking circle. While it is a complicated decision, it's certainly worth reaching out to your family doctor, your pediatrician, psychiatrist to have that conversation if it feels like it might be relevant for your child. Some of the take-home messages I hope that came across today is that the earlier you start the intervention process with your child, the better it will be for the child. We just know that this work is so much easier and goes more smoothly the younger a child is. So if you're at all thinking your child is a reluctant speaker or has selective mutism, certainly reach out and get some help. New skills for getting a child to speak would include the warm-up process that you learned a bit about today, so the playing with them without asking questions, and then starting to encourage speech in a strategic way using forced choice questions and setting them up for success with a lot of practicing. As well, remember to fade in new people slowly and to set it up in a step-by-step way, and expect that you might feel a little bit of anxiety when you do this with your child. As much as you can either pretend or actually feel confident or to be playful, it will go better. Selective mutism is very treatable. There's every reason to be hopeful that your child is going to do well with these interventions. And if not, there's a lot of help that you can ask for out there to make sure that your child goes along the right track with this disorder. Here's some resources that have been talked about actually before. The third one is the video that Dr. Catchpole mentioned. No, the second one is the video. Sorry. The second one is a video that Dr. Catchpole mentioned would be a good complement to this webinar. And then there's some more resources there as well that you can visit. Thank you very much. And please add some questions to the Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sally, Dr. DiGiacomo, and Dr. Catchpole. And thank you to everyone who submitted questions. So we'll get to as many questions as we can in the time that we have left. If we don't get to your question or you think of a question after the webinar, please don't hesitate to contact us at the Kelsey Center, and we'd be happy to help answer your question. So with no further ado, we'll jump right into the questions. So the first question is, how do I let people know, family members or strangers, that my child has selective mutism and won't respond to their questions? So that it's not them being rude, that they just can't answer. Dr. Catchpole?
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. So certainly with strangers, it's a little bit more tricky, but what I would do is sort of focus on those situations where you know the person and you might have a little bit more control of that situation. And what I would first do is try to figure out if you can get some of those people on your team. Because if someone's willing to have some warm-up time with a child and to actually go about this in a more structured way, they're more likely to be successful. With strangers, I would probably just let the question go unanswered rather than jumping into answer for the child too much. But you've got much more bang for your buck with people that are willing to help and that you know.
Great, thank you so much. So the next question is from a parent who's wondering and feeling like they're feeling like they're the trigger for their child's anxiety. So she seems to shut down more in my presence. I have tried not answering for her if I know she can answer, but she will shut down with both familiar and unfamiliar people, but tends to do okay when there is only one other person in addition to me. What are some strategies if I'm already very encouraging but not pushing or forcing her to do things when she's uncomfortable and the parent is acknowledging her feelings?
I can start again on this one, and then the others please jump in. I wanted to make sure that we got to this question because we wanted to tell you that it's quite common actually for kids to have a little bit more anxiety when their parents around. That doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong or that you've caused this problem in any way. I think it really goes back to what Dr. DiGiacomo said, which is that our jobs are to protect kids. And so all of our kids are not always their bravest when their cozy, mom or dad or caregiver is there. What we would say really practically is you always want to figure out where are you having success and what's the next step. So if your child is able to talk to one other person with you there, that's amazing. That's the start of your ladder, right? So then it might be about trying to add one more person slowly into that situation. Or if your child is speaking comfortably to a couple peers but tends to get a little quieter when you're there, maybe you work on rewarding and praising situations where you are getting a little bit closer. So I think those are the main things I would say. I don't know if Dr. Sally or Dr. DiGiacomo have anything to add.
I would just maybe say one other thing, and to echo Dr. Catchpole, this is really common. It's super common for kids to have more trouble talking when their parent or caregiver is there. One thing I found useful is you can be funny and add humor and be playful even in a situation like this. So you can make it kind of a game with your child. You could say, we know it's harder for you to use your brave voice when mommy's here. And so it doesn't have to be a really serious kind of concerning thing. You can put it out there for your child, and then sometimes that helps to work on it more in the latter structured way when it's kind of out there. Everyone knows what's going on. Everyone knows that, that's what we're working on and it's okay.
Great, thank you. And I think we have time for one more question. And thank you for putting the final slide up. So our contact information is on this slide if you wanted to email us or call us from anywhere in BC if we didn't get to your question or you think of something afterwards. So the final question is from a parent whose daughter is starting kindergarten in the fall and wondering what supports they should advocate for. So I know you spoke a bit about that when you talked about preparing your team, but anything for a child just starting kindergarten?
I love this question. And so I think the time before kindergarten starts is actually a golden time. So what we know is that if we can prevent things from getting hard, it's a lot easier than kind of having to fix problems when they already start. So often I've had teachers be really willing to meet with kids one-on-one, like in that week before school starts, in the last week of August before September. And we'll think about the scaffolding principle here too. So if the child can see the classroom, before the other kids, just kind of get the lay of the land, and then maybe meet the teacher just for a few minutes on their own in the classroom, just to get used to the environment and to establish a talking relationship with that teacher before the busyness of school starts, that is often more than enough to really get the kid going. But I would definitely recommend trying to do something like that.
Yeah, I would just add it's a good idea to reach out to the school in the months leading up to kindergarten, and now would be a good time to just put your child on their radar to say, oh, my child is a reluctant speaker or has selective mutism or has a hard time talking, and generally they'll set up a meeting with you via Zoom or over the phone just to talk about your child's profile, and that will allow them to start to plan maybe that early meeting with the teacher that Dr. DiGiacomo mentioned, as well as encouraging you to bring the child to the school playground, getting them familiar with the area, letting them play on the play structures. And some schools are even able to let them come in for a quick meeting in June before summer starts, and then again in September before the school actually starts. So it's really important to reach out now if you can to prepare for that transition. Schools may want a letter for accompanying that process of giving that diagnosis to them, in which case you can also reach out to your family doctor or pediatrician.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dr. DiGiacomo, Dr. Sally, and Dr. Catchpole for your time today and all these really tangible, practical strategies and laying it out so clearly. Thank you to everyone who took the time to join us today and attend. Again, if you do have any questions, don't hesitate to contact us. And when the webinar ends, a survey will pop up. We, again, really encourage you to take a few minutes to complete that because it will really help us out in planning for future webinars. So thanks again, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon.